You're listening to the Place Northwest podcast, your digital resource for the latest insight and analysis on all things property in the northwest of England.
Hello and welcome to this Place Northwest podcast. I'm your host, Dan Whelan. You are listening to the second episode of a four-part podcast series on co-living, sponsored by Purdon Life. Since 2019, Purdon Life has been operating Manchester's first co-living scheme on Swan Street in the Northern Quarter. The company offers flexible, all-inclusive living, with bills, events and weekly food deliveries all included in the rent. Part of the Shenton Group, Purdon Life has plans to expand co-living, not just in Manchester and Salford, but across the UK and Europe. For more information, visit oppurdon-life.com. In the first episode of the series, we discussed the co-living story so far, and today we will talk about the barriers currently facing the sector, the attitudes of local authorities towards the emerging residential model, and the idea of introducing legislation to unlock the doors of co-living in the coming years. Joining me to discuss this are Colin Shenton, Chief Executive of the Shenton Group, and Andrew Purdon, Head of Co-Living Transactions at CBRE. Hello to you both.
Hi, Dan.
Hi.
Nice to have you both with us today. Andrew, we'll start with you. You've been in your job as Head of Co-Living Transactions at CBRE for about 18 months now. Can you tell us what your job entails day to day and what it's been like taking it from the beginning to where we are now?
Sure. Well, but by way of context for that question, Dan, co-living sits within our residential capital markets function at CBRE. So that's split into three parts in no particular order of importance, but build to rent, which you'll be very familiar with, student housing, which obviously is the most established resi to rent sector in the UK. And now co-living is coming through rapidly. My job day to day is to advise developer clients mainly on how to shape their schemes and then ultimately to deliver a funding solution for the development.
Okay, excellent. And so, Colin, Purdon Life is growing. We'll talk more about one of your upcoming schemes later on. But could you tell me what co-living is in your opinion? You know, the jury's out a little bit on how to define it. What is it in your opinion? Is it build to rent? Is it an HMO? Is it student living? Is it none of the above?
Well, it's paradoxically none of the above, but it takes the best bits of all of them. So we believe co-living is a subsector of BTR. It's not a sector on its own, and it's part of the much needed fragmentation of the residential model in terms of how we're able to deliver high quality housing at a time of greatest need. And some of that's owned, some of it's rented, and within the rented sector, it could be a mixture of short and long term. Urban and suburban, and co-living meets the need for high-end, hospitality-driven city centre residential, which is rented. So it's almost a sector within a sector, and in that sense, it's quite easy to define.
Absolutely, and there is a negative perception among some people of co-living. Andrew, why do you think that is? And are they misconceptions or are they sort of truths?
There is some negative sentiment around it. There certainly was, I would say, during the early stages of the pandemic. I think that the first thing that lots of policymakers in particular get rather fixated on is the size of the private studio or room within the co-living environment, because it is undeniably more compact than C3 residential minimum space standards. And there's when we were all locked down at home during the early stage of the pandemic, and hopefully that won't come back again. Obviously, there were concerns around the quality of life for people living in those spaces and the ability of people to enjoy the abundant amenities, which is the main difference with other forms of residential, particularly build to rent. The spirit of co-living is to engage with your fellow residents and to be part of a community, and that happens through design and through events in the communal parts of the building rather than the private studio. So it's just a different way to think about the distribution distribution of housing, the distribution of uses within a building. And to answer your question, Dan, I think there is, generally speaking, in the UK, a fear of the unknown. It's new, and it takes time for people to understand what it's all about. I think as we get more planning consents and more buildings constructed and operated by great operators, the perception will change. But right now we're at the early stages of life for co-living. So, some policymakers and investors, to be fair, some of them will think that it looks a bit new and scary, whereas others will say, you know what, this is fantastic, and we really do see a need for it in our cities and towns.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, it's a new product. There's a lot of unknowns there, and I guess the burden then for the pioneers of this sector is they have to deal with all of those obstacles that they're facing, and then later down the line, when there's widespread adoption, it'll be much easier. Colin, just to go back on a point that Andrew made there about the minimum space standards, do you think that fixation on minimum space standards is holding co-living back, and do you think that's fair?
I don't think it's holding co-living back unless you look at co-living as a C3 planning class use. So there are national space standards, which not all authorities adhere to. It's guidance rather than a rule. Those who do apply them are applying them to C3 schemes. So the conversation that we have starts with probably a sui generis consent, followed by a separate use class for co-living. So it doesn't have to go into this catch-all sui generis section. And I think Andrew actually just hit on the point, which is exactly the difference between C3 BTR and co-living, which is the way in which the amenity spaces are used. So, for example, if you look at BTR, you've got your minimum space standards, 61 square meters for a two-bed flat and so on. You're applying those standards to the entirety of the area that the occupier has a right to use. If you look at co-living, you might say, oh, my studio is only 20 square meters. Yeah, but you've also got 500, maybe 1,000 square meters, maybe more, of additional amenity space, which is completely available to you at any one time. And so you're not, you might be renting 20 square meters, but you're living in 1,020 square meters. You're living in the biggest flat in the country, actually, and the quid pro quo is some of that space is shared. So if you look at standard BTR, where you might say, I'm renting my flat, I've got access to these other spaces, because a lot of BTR schemes have lots of amenity too. Co-living is, well, I'm just really getting the bedroom part of an apartment, and then I'm using all of the rest of it. And one of the things that came out of COVID is that while nobody wants that to happen again, if you have a small co-living setup, as we trialled with our Manchester building, 15 units, that became a bubble. And the principal difference there was our co-living building had 15 studios, it had 4 shared amenity spaces, 15 people became a bubble. They were able to move around those spaces. There was no issues of urban loneliness, there was no issues of people being stuck in a glorified, bedroom for any longer than they had to be. Whereas we went and looked at some of the other BTR schemes, and all of their amenity was closed. The spa was closed, the swimming pool was closed, the games room was closed, whatever else, because they have a population in a large BTR building of hundreds of people. Hundreds of people can't be a bubble, and so they were then confined to their apartments, and they were paying the service charges to use all these amenity spaces, but they were locked off. Whereas in a co-living building, and we can come on, I guess, later to the mental health benefits of co-living. All of these shared spaces continued to be available. And so one of the reasons why we're keen to have a defined use class, shall we say, for co-living, is that the way in which they operate is quite different from BTR, and we feel much to the benefit of the occupier.
Okay, so let's come on to that use class question now. Andrew, what problems that co-living currently faces would having its own use class solve? Colin mentioned sui generis there, and there's limitations that can be imposed if you're using that use class. What are the problems that its own use class, let's say a C6 use class, what could that solve?
Well, I think what it will do, Dan, if there was a defined use class, and actually to be fair, there are different policy positions on co-living depending where you are in the country. I'm based in London, as you know, but I do operate across the UK. The London Plan has a co-living policy, and it sets out some broad parameters of what it is and where it's appropriate. So things like, as Colin just mentioned, single ownership, all the units are for rent, minimum stay of 3 months. There's description that you have to have a management plan submitted to the local authority. So there is a sort of a framework upon which planning applications can be judged or considered, I should say. But what it doesn't do is go as far as to say this is how big the unit should be, and this is the scale of the amenity relative to the number of units. It's still quite loose as a framework, and the problem that provides is that for people like Colin who are promoting schemes, across the country and particularly in Manchester and Salford, there's an awful lot of time spent trying to pin down what the policy actually means. And you spend a lot of time then going through multiple pre-application meetings, and it becomes very subject to interpretation by the local authority or the planning body. Consequence of that is it slows the market down. It takes an awful lot of time and money to even submit an application, never mind have it determined. And that's bad for our cities, because we all know that we've got hugely growing populations in our major cities, and Manchester is at the forefront of that. And if you can't deliver the housing of the right type in the right place in the right time frame, that's going to hold our city economies back and affect the desirability of our city. So, long-winded answer, but to create its own class nationally would be incredibly helpful, just to define the parameters more closely. That then gives a rulebook for developers and designers to work with, and policymakers to consider projects against. And it just speeds things up, makes it clearer for everyone, and we know what we're dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. And so essentially, Colin, you're calling for more regulation, which, regulation seen as a negative, has negative connotations in terms of a lack of, ability to be creative, but you're actually asking for that regulation for co-living.
Yeah, I mean, it's rare for a capitalist to ask to be regulated, but actually, it's very helpful to have a framework, because it's not just developers. The development process involves planners, local communities, developers, funders, valuers, architects. There's a dozen or more stakeholders in every planning application, and the clearer the framework for planning is, the more likely it is that developers can be told what is and is not acceptable, and can decide whether they want to provide it, and the local community can decide whether it's something that they want in their area, and the councillors on the planning committee can be happy that they're meeting the requirements of policy and the delivery of housing. I don't think there's a local authority in the country, barely, that has a sufficient supply of housing. And one of the things that they tackle, actually, is where they give consents for schemes which are then not delivered, because economics or viability go against them. Land values are under pressure because construction costs are rising dramatically. So one of the advantages of co-living is you get a bit more density. You also get lower rents, and so you've got more affordability, greater viability, and for those two reasons combined, more deliverability. And so these are all things that people need to know at the beginning of the process. And so if you have a definition of what the scheme would be, and it's not a difficult thing to define, then everybody can see whether you are as a developer abiding by the rules, and that makes the process easier. So really, regulation equals clarity as far as we're concerned, and that's why we're calling for it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was having a flick through Manchester City Council's housing strategy 2021 this morning. Had a look through a presentation that they provided, and basically it says that there is a housing shortage. We need all types of housing across all tenures to address that shortage. But in the report and the presentation, there wasn't a single mention of co-living, which is worrying for companies like Hopper Life and people who would like that co-living concept. I want to move on to talk about your specific experiences, Colin, with Salford City Council. You're currently preparing an application for a 21-storey co-living scheme, 236 homes. What's that process been like? Has it been as difficult as I expected it to be, given all the obstacles facing co-living at the moment?
Actually, the issue that we've had with that application is the normal one of height, massing, architecture, stuff that we'd expect to have to work our way through on any scheme. And Salford's approach has been, in principle, co-living is acceptable. We would like to see it as a sui generis rather than a C3 application. And just to be cautious, they'd like the floor layouts to be done in such a way that if co-living is a flash in the pan and doesn't last, the building can be reconfigured to be normal BTR. And that's informed some of the layouts, some of the room sizes and so on. And we've actually gone a step further and made it suitable for C3 BTR and also suitable for a C1 hotel use, just to give us the greatest number of options in case that's right. I mean, I've got absolutely no qualms whatsoever that co-living is going to be successful and is going to be with us forever. But I understand, the council's position is to be conservative with a small c and to take baby steps and not to do anything which they might find to be irreversible and to be a mistake. So I'm completely on board with Salford's approach, which is a cautious welcoming of co-living. If you do it in the right way, you consult early and properly, and you're willing to be flexible, and the developer understands that this is a nascent sector and the council understands the same thing, you can take baby steps and help each other down the path of righteousness to the correct scheme. In other areas, it's just a blanket, we don't like it, don't bother asking. So you've got to be quite picky as a developer to make sure you're in the right local authority to put these things forward. However, what will happen is developers like us and others will produce schemes in those local authority areas, demonstrate that it works, demonstrate that they're successful and that there's demand for them and they're properly managed. And that hopefully will encourage the more reticent local authorities to take another look at it. It's a 5-10 year program of proving yourself, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And, caution there seemed to be the key word in terms of Salford's approach, sort of hedging their bets. If it doesn't work out, we can go to BTR, we can go to hotel. Does that chime, Andrew, with the sort of the schemes that you're working on across the country? Is that a similar approach that other local authorities are taking?
Just to pick up something that Colin said there, that developers have to be picky and careful on where they're selecting to try and promote the scheme. So it's absolutely the same for us as advisors. And compliance with policy is actually desirable for developers. Sometimes there's a perception that developers are trying to sort of dodge the system or get around the rules. That my experience with our clients is it's absolutely not the case. What they want is a clear route to a consent in a timely manner. Of course, there is a process and consultation to go through, but we want to be feeling like we're pulling in the same direction with the people considering the application. And exactly the same as Colin described, some areas of London, some boroughs in London are notoriously more difficult than others. And therefore, part of our job as advisors is to guide our clients on which boroughs to focus on. And it's not about planning. It's also about the basics of the population, affordability of rents, access to land, where can you afford to buy the land, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not as simplistic as saying it's all about planning, but every developer in the land is having to navigate through what is quite a challenging planning process in this country. And in terms of regional activities and cities, it's interesting that Birmingham, for example, has recently published a draft co-living policy, which is really quite negative. But contrary to the way that the Birmingham marketing machine is presenting their city, which is all about population growth, fantastic universities, huge student population, and a 50%-ish graduate retention rate. Those people are welcomed and wanted to be kept in the Birmingham city, but it doesn't seem to then translate into the policies around housing. The housing typologies in this country, and particularly in our city centres, haven't really changed much over the last 20 years. I mean, build to rent has come in, and that's provided a much better rental proposition to residents. But in my opinion, co-living is a subset of build to rent. I agree with Colin on that for sure, but it's targeting and providing accommodation specifically for a cohort of renters that isn't really accommodated in build to rent in the same way. It's for typically young people who are, generally speaking, single households. So why wouldn't we want to provide a fit for purpose bespoke housing offer for those people, because they're so important for the success of our cities.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting the point you make about Birmingham, and they've taken a stance there, be it right or wrong, and at some stage councils across the country are going to have to take their own stance because, like you say, this sector is growing.
And I think let's be realistic. City leaders, they compete with one another. The leaders of Manchester will be thinking, well, what's happening in Birmingham, and vice versa with Leeds and Glasgow and Edinburgh. I do think that having a relevant housing offer is a massive part of competitiveness for city successes, particularly as we're trying to promote 24/7 economies in our city centres. We need people living in the city centres and spending money and enjoying culture and nightlife. And from an environmental perspective, we want our city centres to be, full of people living there, so they're walking to work. They're not driving. It's more sustainable. We need to use our raw material in land in a different way, and it's very precious material. And therefore, having a dense form of housing which serves a very important part of the local population, to me, is a really positive and logical thing to be promoting.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've talked about planning authorities there, and I guess convincing the planning officers is half of the battle. And Colin, you see, it sounded like Salford was being quite receptive to the concept of co-living, but then you've got to convince the planning committee as well, and that can be a whole different kind of battle, can't it?
Yes, and I think that crucially comes down to operations. So it's not so much the building, the architecture, or the layout. I think what they're concerned about, and why they want these buildings to be capable of being used in other ways, is that co-living does depend upon a professional provision of management. It's not just cleaning the common areas and making sure the lift works, which is pretty run-of-the-mill BTR stuff. It's also, it's the co part of it is about bringing people together, and the way we believe you do that is you provide the resources, the spaces, the whatever it is, for that to happen. You don't push it, but you create the environments which people can spend time together easily, and those spaces have to be properly managed. And so there is a hospitality element, if you like, to co-living, which is very different from BTR, but entirely similar to hotel. And it's really where hospitality and BTR overlap on the Venn diagram. And I think one of the concerns local authorities have is that most developers will build and sell, move on, and don't care at all about what happens to the building thereafter. Whereas Operative Life's view is that we develop and retain, and so we do care about what the building will be doing in 5 or 10 years' time. And not every co-living developer is going to be able to afford to retain buildings, and so you have to have a separate management function. And I could understand it's quite difficult for a local authority to take comfort or have credibility from a developer who says, yeah, of course I'm going to do a great job managing all these event spaces, and we're going to have pizza night, and we're going to do all these great things. And of course they don't provide them. And I think local authorities are right to be nervous about that. One of the reasons why I think this is going to take some years to reach critical mass is, as well as the regulation of a planning use class, I'd quite like to see some branding in co-living which you don't normally get in regular house building. If you go and buy a house from a main house builder, you don't really care if it's Redrow or Barratt. You care about the design, the location, and the price. Whereas in BTR, there are no brands, and in property management, certainly there are no brands. But in hotel, everything of value is branded. So if I go to Manchester City Council and say, I want to build a Marriott, they'll go, yeah, we know what a Marriott is, we know it will be properly managed, go ahead. If I go to them and say, my mate fancies running a hotel, they will say no. So it's true in co-living that if you get a brand like Opperton Life or Gravity or the Collective, and you can say, look, we've already done this, here is our track record, go and talk to our tenants, go and speak to our existing buildings, we've been doing this for years. That brand is super important in terms of delivering the promise of what co-living can be. And this is why it's a bit of a Bambi business. It's still uncertain on its legs as it's trying to stand up, and which is why I think we all have to be a bit patient to let the local authorities come on this journey with us. But the reason I'm confident about it is there are some local authorities willing to give it a go, and as they prove it to be successful, the Manchesters and the Birminghams and Southern London boroughs will say, actually, it's not so bad. I can see Opperton's been going for 5 or 10 years. They've made a success of it. If Opperton comes to us to propose a building, we're going to feel comfortable and we'll say yes to it. And that's the investment that we as a developer have to make into the sector, an investment of time and patience to sort of earn the credibility and the trust of the local authorities. And we're certainly willing to do that.
No, absolutely. And Andrew, are you seeing in your day to day, are you being approached by more and more developers looking to get into this space? Is it an enticing prospect for developers?
It absolutely is enticing. And actually, just to respond to something that Colin said, I think what I'm seeing now for sure is diversification into co-living from established brand and operators and developers in adjacent sectors, and particularly student and BTR. So it's no coincidence, for example, that Vita Group, who are so well known in your backyard, are diversifying into co-living with their St John's scheme. They have a long pedigree of building beautiful buildings and operating them fantastically, and I think that history and pedigree gives great confidence to the planners. Colin's point is that if you go in and you're an unknown entity, that instinctively makes the conversation more harder, harder with the local authorities. And Vita are not alone. We see activity now from Watkin Jones, who you'll be familiar with in Northwest too. They're coming into co-living. What we are also seeing is a different type of capital partner coming into this market. So if you turn up to the local authority and you've got a fantastic developer and operator, and you have a well-known pension fund sitting alongside them as the funder, that also gives great confidence to the planners that actually this building will be run really well, it will deliver on its promises, and the interests of the owner are long-term. They want to make this a success and fulfill their obligations and promises to the local people, because they have ethical standards that everyone's comfortable with. So that's part of the evolution. I mean, it's actually history repeating itself, because exactly the same growing pains were experienced with BTR 10 years ago. When we were promoting the early schemes in BTR, we got the same issues. Why would we want bespoke rental product in our city centres? Because surely everyone wants to own a flat. That was the typical response. But over time, there's been an acknowledgement that the rental population is growing and will continue to grow, and that we need choice for all types of tenures in our city centres.
Yeah, absolutely. And another name, you mentioned your Vitas, your Watkin Jones there. Another name to throw into the mix is Downing. Huge scheme approved in Manchester last year. And you also touched on my next question to you, which was about funding. So we know that PRS, for example, has kind of weathered the storm of COVID very, very well. It's seen as a very robust product and a worthwhile investment and a stable investment. Are we there yet with co-living, or are we still sort of approaching that point?
The challenge with answering that question, with evidence at the moment, Dan, is that there aren't enough buildings actually to analyse that have been through a stabilised period and through the pandemic. I mean, we're literally talking about a handful across the country. But from a CBRE perspective, we absolutely believe that the same stability of income will be driven from co-living as you see in BTR, and that's why the investors are attracted to it as well. Repeating myself, but it's just providing rental accommodation for a slightly different audience of renters. It's a subset of BTR. It's as simple as that, and that's why the capital markets will react, in a similar way as they had to BTR. The market will grow. Some investors will want to wait and see a bit first, just to see what the actual performance looks like of the assets when they're built, whereas others will say, you know what, we believe the investment rationale, we think it is very, very similar to BTR. They might price it slightly differently for a little bit of risk, but we're not struggling with investor demand for co-living. Is the battle at the moment is just getting planning consents with the right sponsors, the right developers behind them to actually enable the investors to deploy their money.
Yeah, absolutely. And Colin, on that point, what's the funding model look like for your Salford scheme?
Well, it's actually a pretty standard model. It's something that we've bought, we'll develop, retain, operate, we'll keep it for the long term. So, we put our own cash equity in up front at the beginning of a development facility. We refinance that with long-term money, and long-term money is getting cheaper and more long-term, which enables you to amortize your debt from surplus income more readily, which is something we'd be keen to do, and take a longer-term view. I mean, long-term gilts are, very cheap, and when I say long-term, it's sort of 25 years plus. We had a conversation with a Danish bank about a month ago who was lending 30-year money at 1% payable. I mean, it's not quite free, but it's almost free. But the appeal of that, not the 1% really, was the 30-year term, because that enables you to plan with great confidence and to keep investing in your buildings. So the answer to your question is quite bland, in as much as there's no fancy new financial model required for this. It's just the same as any other residential development, followed by a long-term residential mortgage, and the market's awash with debt and with equity for the right thing, and the market shouldn't be awash with equity for the wrong thing, should it?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to go very briefly before we finish into a bit more detail on the Salford scheme, firstly, when can we expect the planning application to be validated? And also, could you give us a bit of a flavour of what that building is going to look like?
Yes, we're expecting to have planning granted, as opposed to the application validated, by the end of this calendar year. So would there be a start on site first quarter of 22? Mm-hmm. And the building will reflect what we think is the unique nature of the Opperden co-living model, which is that we slice the building into its individual stories, and we create a co-living community on each floor. So you'll see some co-living models which function a bit like a hotel, where you've got lots of amenity on the ground floor and then flats above, whether they're studios, 1s, 2s, 3s, 4 bedrooms, or whatever it is. The Opperden Life model is all studios, 20 square meters each or more. But what we realized when we did our first small building was there's an optimal size of a community. If you live in a building of 500 people, you're not going to know 500 people. It's quite difficult to sift through the 20 or 30 that you do want to know. You've got to meet them all first and decide which ones you like. That's not going to happen. So if you live on a floor of, say, 15 studios of 20 meters a pop with their own kitchens, their own bathrooms, they function as private residences, in their own right. And in addition, you've maybe got a third or a quarter of the whole floor given over to shared amenity. You create a community, and in COVID terms, a bubble, much as we don't want that to return, of sort of an optimal number of people who you can get to know, who you want to live with, you can form a friendship and a social structure with. And so that's how this building will be. So it's however many upper floors, each of which is a separate Opperden Life co-living unit. And then on the ground and first floors, there'll be some co-working, which we already run elsewhere as Operating Social. And there'll be a new bar concept, which we also do in-house, called Hyper, which is a cousin to the Mechanica bar that we already have in Manchester. And some additional social spaces, plus as much external space as possible. I'm really big on roof terraces and balconies. So every apartment has its own balcony. So you've all got some outside space, which is private to that individual, private kitchen, private shower room, private balcony. And then you've got shared internal spaces for your floor. You've got shared external roof terraces for your floor. And then in addition, on the ground and first floor, you've got shared spaces for the whole building. And that's where you can have your Christmas party and your co-working, all the rest of it. So it's really about choice. So people can choose to have their private apartment, their shared spaces on their floor, the shared spaces for the whole building. And co-living in general is about choice, which is why I talk about fragmentation. Lots of people do want a 61 square metre 2-bed to live in by themselves. They're entitled to have that, and it's the majority of the market. But there are some people who want something a bit different. And as hotels have fragmented, so residential needs to fragment in order to give the city centres this boost of activity and energy that they so need post-lockdown.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do you envisage? Let's throw it forward a little bit, and I'll come to you in a second, Andrew. What proportion of the market will co-living occupy once it's in full flow? In your opinion, Colin?
As Andrew rightly says, it's not for everybody. It's not for either a very narrow demographic. It's really a question of it attracts a certain attitude of mind rather than a certain socio-economic background or religious or gender or whatever else it might be. So the demographic itself is quite wide. I'm guessing, but I would guess it's 10 to 15% the size of the BTR market. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean it won't be 50,000 units a year when it's mature.
Yeah, and Andrew, we'll finish with you. In the last, we spoke before the podcast, and you said in the last sort of 0 to 5 years, we've seen a massive growth from basically 0 to where we are now. Let's throw it forward another 5. How do you envisage the trajectory and the journey of co-living between now and 2026, let's say?
Well, I think back to the pain points at the moment. We need more planning consents, and we need the right developers, operators, investors promoting these projects. That's definitely happening. The market, the property markets across the country. We are seeing top class developers and investors looking to deploy into co-living. The growth trajectory will be largely influenced by the speed of the planning consents. These buildings take 2+ years to build in reality. But what I hope for, in the 5-year time horizon is that we have, tens, if not more, of fantastic, really well-run buildings across the country that planners can take great confidence when they go and see them. At the moment, there isn't much to look at. The proof of concept, which, back to my previous point, there's a slight fear of the unknown right now. We need to allow the market to grow with the right stakeholders working on the projects. And I think the other really important point is that I'm a strong believer that in 5 years' time, co-living won't be regarded as this alternative residential product. It will become part of the mainstream build-to-rent family, and it will be an institutional grade pension fund compliant product. We're already seeing pension funds coming into the market, involved in various transactions that are being backed by pension funds, but it's, to really grow aggressively and quickly and to provide funding solutions for developers, like Colin and others, if he wanted to go down that route. We need those capital providers to participate in the market as well.
Brilliant. Yeah, a fantastic sort of look behind the co-living curtain today. Thank you so much, Colin and Andrew, for your time.
Thanks
for having us.
Since 2019, Opperden Life has been operating Manchester's first co-living scheme on Swan Street in the Northern Quarter. The company offers flexible, all-inclusive living, with bills, events and weekly food deliveries all included in the rent. For more information, visit opperden-life.com.